So I've been thinking a lot of the September 11th attacks recently. I always do it this time of the year. Um, Even though I wasn't directly involved in the event, I mean, I didn't know anyone who died, and I didn't have any personal connections other than just being another citizen of the world who knew about the event. But it does always get me emotional. I watched the film United 93 last night. I've seen it many times, but it's a very, very powerful film. Paul Greengrass has a particular directorial style. He also had dramas concerning the Northern Ireland Troubles, Bloody Sunday, and Oma. And his style is known for being very intense. He deliberately uses not well-known actors. Very powerful film if you haven't seen it. And it's incredible how much the actors look like the real people that they portray. But anyway, what I want to talk about is how we perceive victims of a tragedy or an atrocity. Let's not forget 9/11 was an atrocity. It wasn't a disaster. It was a tragedy, but it wasn't a disaster. It was an atrocity. It was a man-made event. And I'm not going to get into the realm of conspiracy theories, but I just want to point out that, when we think of victims of 9/11, we tend to think of to be precise, 2,977 people who died in the four planes in the World Trade Center and in the Pentagon. By the way, sometimes I think the Pentagon is overlooked. It was one of the major sites of the day, but there hasn't really been the same public interest in the Pentagon. I think because visual images of the Twin Towers are so poignant, so powerful. Whereas with the Pentagon, we only have that CCTV footage and sort of the smoldering remnants afterwards. It's not as visually um, out there as the images of the Twin Towers were. But and this year, of course, with coronavirus, the restrictions on commemorations have been greater. Um, but when we think about it, around 6,000 people were wounded from a range of things, falling debris, first responders who were wounded in recovery efforts, um, the number of people who were below the stairwells that were affected and managed to get out. Um, So that already brings the casualty figures to close to 10,000 people. Then when you start adding up all of those suffering PTSD, first responders and others, when you start adding up the unknown number of people who suffered from respiratory problems, um, I've read different sources that suggest at least 200 people have developed cancer, um, or at least other related respiratory problems from the disaster, from the atrocity. So when you start looking at that, it starts adding up. And then if you consider the suffering that the families have went through, extended families, let's say an average family of five people, when you really start adding it up, the true casualty figures for 9/11 very plausibly goes into tens of thousands. And that's one reason why, although there have been deadlier events, far deadlier events in human history, Um, that's why September 11th remains so poignant. I mean, it defined my generation. I would say for older millennials, we are the 9/11 generation in the sense that that was such an important event in shaping the world for our generation. But this is also true of other human tragedies and disasters and atrocities. Every terror attack there is, and this is why terrorism is such an evil thing. Um, let's say three people die in a terror attack. Now, those three people, let's say they have families. Let's say four or five people in their immediate families. Then they have friends, work colleagues, and they suffer from the loss of their loved one. So that already goes into dozens. Look at all the atrocities there's been in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Somalia, in all the war zones out there. There may be an official estimate for war dead. But when you consider the wounded, when you consider those displaced, when you consider those mentally scarred, then it goes into many, many millions, millions, far more than 9/11. So I think sometimes when we think about human suffering, we have to remember, certainly remember the dead. I'm all for that. I believe in it. But also we have to remember the living. And this can even apply to individual circumstances like murder victims, the family suffering. And in a sense, the focus should be on the family just as much as the deceased. I mean, the deceased is dead, whatever your spiritual, spirituality is, the focus needs to be on the surviving family members because they really are suffering. I'm reluctant to say victims because I think survivor is probably a better term, but yeah, anyway, it's just something to think about. I'm a strong believer in, like I say, I'm quite sentimental. I do believe in remembering the dead. I like candles. I don't mind admitting that for a whole range of things. You know, if I've heard there's been a tragedy somewhere in the world, whether it be a natural disaster, I'm thinking, for example, tonight about the Gulf Coast. My brother's out there, and they're facing yet another hurricane. The big wildfires in California. But you know, there's always tragedy somewhere in the world. Um, could be a plane crash, it could be a train crash, it could be a terrorist incident, it could be a structural collapse, it could be a maritime sinking, it could be anything. And you know, when we look at these abstract things as a news item, let's say 70 people die in plane crash, that's awful. But when you start considering the individual stories, earlier I was looking, for example, at Ukraine Airlines Flight 752, shot down over Iran in January. You know, they were all individual people with their own stories. And when we look at things that way, it becomes particularly poignant. Anyway, it's just something to think about. I don't want to be too depressing, so you know. But it's just something. It's just all the more reason to cherish life, I think, and to just try and care about each other.